Okay, is that too loud? No. Oh, good. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction. Why talk about grand old homes? Well, we have a lot of old homes in Scituate. I think we're really blessed. And some of these are pretty grand, so I wanted to talk about them. Also, I'm completely obsessed with documenting old houses, as you can ask my wife, or any members of my family, or members of the Scituate Historical Commission who've heard me talk about many of these houses before. And so I just want to, let's see if this works. There. So, oops, I have to go back one. So I want to thank some of my enablers, the Scituate Historical Commission I've mentioned, because I presented many documentation of these houses to that commission, and they have been really super supportive. They're actually a part of our Scituate town government. The Scituate Historical Society is private, and I want to thank them for sponsoring this talk. And I want to thank them for just a super collection of historical information at the Historical Society headquarters. That is always something new and surprising that I found when I go over there. The town archives have been terrific for nailing down when these houses were actually built. There's nothing like a tax collector to find out exactly when the house went up. The Scituate Town Library has gotten some pretty obscure books for me that you can't find on the web, and that's been a big help. I want to thank Bob Jackman, who's been my teacher and got me really interested in the history of this area, and homeowners who've been, for the most part, they've been pretty happy for me to document their houses, and they've been helpful in providing some information, more information about the houses, and including photos from 100 years ago, which is just super. In fact, if you find some old photos of houses in Scituate and you want them identified or more information about that, let me know. I kind of hesitate to suggest this, but I just love looking at these, and that's what started me on many of these houses, trying to find out where that house was, who owned it, when it was built, whether it's still there, questions like that. So I've edited a lot of these old family photos come to me, and I've edited almost all of these photos for clarity. So some of my sources, on the left is this blue booklet. It comes in other colors too, but you can. I think it's still available for sale at the Scituate Historical Commission. Ron's shaking his head yes. It's a terrific book. It's got lots of photos of old houses and other things in town, and it's mostly a history of the town up till 1936, written by one of the country's best journalists and writers at the time, Will Irwin, who spent summers here in Scituate. And on the right is a sample of a form that gets filed in the state online database. You can go and check out all these houses online. There's over 1,000 for Scituate. So it helps to know the address or the street, and then you can narrow it down by the street number. This sample, the database is called MACRIS, M-A-C-R-I-S. So if any of you want to do more research, you can just Google that form, that word, and then go into the database. It's a really terrific source of information. Some of the information has been there, and then I've been chipping away at it and adding more and more information. I tend to go into much more detail than the consultants that have done this stuff before in the past, like deed research. Okay, just to outline a roadmap of where we're going tonight. I'm going to talk about Dreamwold, because who can not talk about Dreamwold when you're talking about grand old homes, and about 20 other houses here in town. They're built between 1632 and 1918. The average I figured out was about 1830. There's 17 and a half of these 21 houses that are left, and 4 have been moved at least once. 4 were designed by architects, which is kind of unusual to find in this area. And my definition of grand is pretty subjective. I'm looking for something usually between 4,000 and 6,000 square feet, and some go way beyond that. Like Dreamwold, for example, is just that home alone was 37,000 square feet, as best I can determine. And then I've listed here a bunch of owners, but there's a pretty diverse group of owners that own these houses. And then at the end, if there's time, I'd be happy to, and I hope there is, I'll be happy to take questions from you. So starting with Dreamwold, this was built in 1901, and for all these houses, I've given you a construction date as best I can determine. This photo was taken in 1908. Some of you may be wondering why it doesn't look like what you're used to, but you're used to driving by on that side street and looking at it, which is really the back of the house. So this is the front of the house facing the ocean. As I understand it, Ron, you could correct me, but I think it had an ocean view at the time.
Yes. That's why it was built there.
Yep. Here's the map of 1903 map of, really it's an atlas of Plymouth County, but it's a terrific map of Scituate. I use it all the time. And it has a little section, this takes up about 1/4 of a page, that most of which is for Dreamwold, the estate. And his house is just south of that oval up on the top. You can see the oval is a 1 mile long racetrack. They also had 9-acre polo field, all kinds of activities for horses and cattle and dogs. And of course this room at the Dreamwold that had 22 rooms. And if you look closely at the map, in the bottom right is the green areas. This is where the town hall, the town high school was, and the church, the historic church that's there. So they occupied those green areas. And you can see in the next chart, I've highlighted Tom Lawson's estate, which just completely dwarfs those civic institutions. And if you look at Dreamwold, I've put an arrow pointing towards it on kind of the middle, towards the center on the right. That house is, and it's still there, you know, on Branch Street. That house is probably 2 or 3 times the size of if you put the town hall and the town high school and the church all together. So he really made a big impact in 1901 when he built this house. Just a few more statistics. That's Tom Lawson on the left, a successful businessman in Boston. It had 22 rooms, and it was the highest valued house in Scituate at the time of $30,000. Just for the house itself. It had plenty of room for horses and dogs and other things. I've mentioned the riding academy had room for 3,000 to 5,000 people to watch horses, I guess horses being trotted around. It had cow barns, a pigeon house, poultry house, a windmill, a sewer plant. It had its own blacksmith shop, a paint shop, its own post office, and a vegetable house. And I probably a lot more too that I didn't have room to list here. Just to get a feel for his impact on the town, in 1918 he paid 5% of the total town's taxes. And he employed a lot of people in town at the time. It comprises 400 acres. What I showed you on that map before was most of it, 400 acres is about the same size as the Principality of Monaco. So you can think of Tom Lawson as the Principality of Dreamwold. Now, going way back in time, the oldest house that I've found in my research, it's not there anymore. It's the Collier house. That was at the end of Gannett Road, just before you reach the ocean. And I guess the intersecting road was then called Beach Street, but it's now called Glades Road, I think. So this is a neat photo. This is from the Daughters of American Republic book put out in 1921 called Old Scituate. You can find this online. It's a terrific book, and it has a lot of old photos like this one. This got demolished in 1980. Okay. Now another one that most people think of as the oldest one in town, and it could be, is the Williams Barker House, otherwise known as the Barker Tavern. This is an older photo of it before the wing got added on the left for weddings and so forth. And this was built supposedly in 1634. They call these colonials. You know, there was a reason for that because we were a colony back then of England. And another colonial house is the Otis Turner House. This one started about 1644, and that got demolished in the 1640s. This was located on Turner Avenue. Actually, the first owner was a member of the Otis family, I believe, and then the Turners. And then the Turners developed that whole area of north of town. It's not totally up to North Scituate, but that got developed into a whole bunch of houses that you can see today. The Jacob Hatch, you know this if you're going around the Rotary. This is the one that faces the Rotary, and it's now in the back has been built a whole complex of medical and professional buildings. Physical therapists are there. My physical therapist is there, and I think there's some other activities going on there as well. And this house has pretty much been preserved like this. It no longer has the side porches that are screened in, but it looks pretty much like that. And as best I could tell, this goes back to 1720 or thereabouts. So that's a pretty old house. We're gradually going to move pretty much chronologically through these from oldest to newer houses. Then there's a lot of Turners involved in this town. Humphrey Turner was one of the original members from England that settled the town. And he had a lot of kids, and his kids had a lot of kids. So you see a lot of Turners here. This was the Job Turner house, about 1790. This started in Boston, and it got moved by boat, I think, to Cohasset and Scituate, right on the town line. And then about 1928 to 1932, it got moved into Scituate. It only had to get moved a few feet, but then it got moved to Scituate. This is still there, and it's on Border Street, just before you hit Cohasset. Anyone here know where this house is? Captain Webb House, about 1840. You raise your hand if you do. Yeah.
It's the old Webb House. It was the rectory.
Yes. Very good. I didn't even plant that question with David. Thank you, David. Yeah, that's this house, the St. Mary's Rectory. Still there, looks the same. I haven't nailed down the exact date when it was built, but it's pretty certain it was the 1840s. It's pretty well documented in the Scituate Mariner and some of the other sources from the 1980 or so. Actually, you can find, I should say, one of my sources is the town library. On their website, about halfway down, you have a link now to all the local papers from 1929 forward, including the Scituate Mariner, which is just terrific. So this was owned originally by Captain Seth Webb. He was a sea captain, and his part was just the front part here. The rest of it was added on later. Another colonial. This was the originally built as a farmhouse for the Turner family. It soon went into the Welch family, and then 3 generations grew up there. And then in 1918 or 1919, it turned into the Scituate Country Club, the clubhouse for the country club, and that's still there. So if you drive down Driftway and you see set back way from the Driftway up on the hill is this house. This was built about 1800. Okay, so just take a second here, pause to look at the timeline. In 1871, the railroad came to Scituate. Scituate got a reputation for picturesque features like its Irish mossing industry and for its historic houses too. It was considered a quaint old New England town, and so people from Boston and surrounding areas would come down here for a visit to take a look at this cute little town. It still is cute. And it became a seaside summer destination for people. Going to the sea was considered a healthful activity starting about 1870 or so, and then things really got rolling later in the 1800s. So these are what was going on in the 1800s. And with the railroad there, you had people like Silas Pierce on the left, who was from Scituate originally, but went to Boston and founded the Silas Pierce Company there in the early 1800s. But maintained a sentimental attachment to his old family's place. As we'll see later, there were 9 generations of Pierces that lived in town. And then that firm, which by the way should not be confused with the S.S. Pierce Company. Well, it is confused. So I can't say it shouldn't be, but it is often confused, but they're 2 separate businesses. And I actually traced the lineage. I'm not a genealogist, but I chased the lineage back to England in the 1400s, and there was still no connection between the 2. But if anyone wants to take that on as an assignment, if they have any kind of genealogical background, that would be kind of interesting to check out. But this Silas Pierce family started, this came out, they were, the ancestor was a fighter in the Indian Wars, in the King Philip Wars, and was killed in one of the battles there. So that's probably the first name you'll come to when you talk about the Pierces of Scituate. So Silas Pierce goes to Boston, as I said, and founded this company. It wound up being the oldest grocery firm in America until probably the 1940s or so, when it was overtaken by the S.S. Pierce Company. But it was even older than the S.S. Pierce Company. And they had branches in Boston and a few other places around New England, as well as southern New Hampshire. So actually you could call them the first chain grocery store. So Silas Pierce, what I call Silas Pierce II, took over the firm, and then his son, Silas Pierce III, took over the son afterwards. So 3 generations of Silas Pierces ran this company. But the first guy was the uncle of the second guy. So that gets a little confused. That's why I call him Silas Pierce II, and then Silas Pierce III. But Silas Pierce II was the first president of the Scituate Historical Society. Silas Pierce III, I'm sorry. And what else? This was the family home. It was called Meadowcrest. It probably had other names, but at the time was called Meadowcrest. This is a view of it in the mid to late 1800s. It still looks pretty colonial type. There was a previous house for the Pierces across the street. This is on Country Way, up around 610, I think. 525, thank you. 545, right. And this is the house that was renovated by Frank Snow about 4 or 5 years ago. Before he renovated, it looked more like this, which is more Victorian. It had really kind of ornate porches on it, other Victorian ornaments on it. And you can see the water tower in the background. That was a feature that was brought in around the about 1870s, 1880s. You'd normally associate that with the water tower that Tom Lawson built for Dreamwold, but others built their own water towers here. And many of them had steps to go up on top so you could have a nice observation of the surrounding area. Another man named John Bailey also came from Scituate and made his money in Boston. And this was in selling doors, sashes, which I think were parts of windows, molding for houses and so forth. So kind of in the interior trim work for houses business, and he was pretty successful. And so he started what we call today the Ellis House. Have some more pictures of that. That's an older picture from about 1874. Again, a lot of Victorian type features, and it was built about 1874. I guess you might call it Queen Anne style, but it's definitely high Victorian style. And it was called Elm Heights, Seaview, and Ellsberg. This is one that had several different names. It gets a little confusing. But today it's owned by the town. It's the home of the Scituate Art Association, and it's also off Country Way, Upper Country Way. But you have to take this long driveway to get up there. It's worth a trip. It's just a terrific looking house. Here's an example of some photos I took earlier this year. And see the main house is in front, and then further houses were added in back later on. And this was valued in 1886 at $8,400, which was a tremendous amount of money at the time. This is another side view of it. You can see how ornate this is. And it's been under renovation. I think they're doing a terrific job. It's a real treasure. Now, another guy who was from Scituate was named Azro Turner, another Turner. Again, anyone who wants to trace the Turner family in town as a genealogical project, that would be great. But he was a farmer up in North Scituate, just off of Gannett Road. I was probably halfway between North Scituate and North Scituate Beach.
That's a pretty substantial building. You would have had Dreamwold to do business or something.
Well, he owned a lot of property. He was probably well-to-do, and he owned a lot of property, and his farming must have made him a lot of money. If you notice, this is a terrific photo that I got from David Corbin. I want to thank David for this. It was just terrific, but it's held by the Scituate Historical Society. If you look, this is one of the most ornate buildings I've seen. It's got the 3.5-story tower on it with kind of a mansard roof and a widow's walk on top of that. So you could stand up there and you probably could see the ocean very well from there.
A lot of these old houses were eventually torn down.
Yeah, I'll get to that. This was built, I just found in the town archives a few days ago, this was built in 1875. And it lasted until 1923, but it had many more lives after Azro Turner's farmhouse. And notice here, this was 2 stories plus an attic in the main house. Here, it's 3 stories. This is on a postcard which shows it when it was called the North Scituate Inn in 1914, after Azro died. Another photo of it when it was Camp Enelef. That's Filene spelled backwards. And sure enough, the Filene family wanted to do some good things for underprivileged or handicapped kids, and so they set their camp up here for the summers in 1916. And then it soon became a similar type facility for what was called the Children's Sunlight Repair Shop. And they felt that getting kids out in the sun, in the country, away from the city, would be helpful for their health. And so they brought a lot of kids out here who were either underprivileged or handicapped. And this is a terrific photo too. I think it really shows off the house very well. There was a huge fire in 1923. That was a big story because the kids had to be carried out. Some were paralyzed and had to be carried out by the nurses and the attendants at the house, but everybody was safe. But the house itself was pretty much demolished by the fire. It's not there anymore. Okay, quick survey of Man Hill. I didn't have time to go into this. In the early 1870s, there were 3 doctors who got together, one from Iowa named Dr. Ely, one from New Hampshire, and one from Boston. And they developed Man Hill all by themselves. And it's a little known secret in town that this was one of the earliest summer colonies for Scituate. So these are some remaining houses that, again, have not been documented, and if I ever have time, I will try to get to it too. But here's just examples of 4 houses. The one on the upper right looks like kind of like a pyramidal type house. Really pretty unique in Scituate. A lot of dormer windows sticking out. The one on the bottom right was the home of a guy named Ely, whose son spent summers there, and the son wound up being governor of Massachusetts. So there's a Scituate connection there. These are all documented only the bottom right one is documented in Macris. Okay, now we go to another guy. I'm not sure, I think he had some connection to Scituate. With a name like Torrey, that's an old Scituate name. But he made his name in Boston as a marble dealer. He had a luxurious townhouse or town estate just down the hill from the monument in Charlestown. And he was also a state legislator. This is a picture of him in a younger age when he was a state legislator. He married Eliza Webb, who was from Scituate, in 1853, and he established a big house and farm there. I think it was called Highland Farm. If you look at the 1903 map, It's called Highland Farm. It was up on Highland Avenue. No, wait. It was up on Greenfield Lane, which was called Highland Avenue at the time. But if you go from Kent Street up the hill, it's probably about a third of the way up the hill on the left side. But it's not, his house is not there anymore. It looked like this. Again, I love these towers. This one's 3.5 stories. Notice that at the top you have these extremely slanted, high-pitched dormer windows. They were on all 4 sides. And the roofs of these dormers had also very high pitches too. So it's really a strange-looking house, I think. But here it is in a Victorian kind of presence. It was built, I think the photo is from the 1870s. What's not in this photo is a water tower, like many other people had, and an observatory, 2 separate vertical objects on the property.
These houses.
And this house got moved down the hill from Greenfield Lane to Kent Street, and then it got moved over a little bit to, I forget the name of the street now, but look at this, look at the tower on this. You see at the top, you have those really pointy dormer windows, so it's almost unmistakable. Plus, I've done deed research to confirm that this was indeed going into that place in about 1918. I guess I should have mentioned that, but about 1918, George Welch had these moved. The house was split in 2 and moved across Blanchard Road from each other. So this is the left half of the house. The right half of the house is no longer there. It was torn down about 2 years ago. There's some construction going on today. If you go by, I'm not sure what's going up. That was the building that actually my father and his wife stayed at when it was a bed and breakfast called the Well-Feathered Nest. And before that, it was the Scituate Hospital. And there are many people in town who were born at the Scituate Hospital right there, but it's not there anymore. So half of the Torrey estate is still in town. There was a guy named George Iannacci who, again, made his money in Boston. He was a liquor dealer, but he built this wonderful Victorian house in Scituate. It is right across from the fire station on First Parish Road. It's still there. It still looks pretty much like this. I'm not doing before and after pictures too much in this presentation, but this is a wonderful photo held by the Scituate Historical Society. The photo was taken by Frederick Damon, who was a wonderful photographer at the time. And this was his store in Boston. He sold wines and liquors for the trade and for family use. This was obviously before Prohibition. And these are 2 of his kids that were at Scituate Harbor. You can see in the background First Cliff. Speaking of First Cliff, here's an aerial photo taken about 1965 of First Cliff. The harbor's in the background. On the far left, upper left, is the bridge that goes over to Second Cliff. And at the far left here, with the red arrow, is the George Walbach house. Another guy made, I think he made money in Boston. He was a lawyer there anyway, but his claim to fame is that he married George Welch's sister. George's father was probably the biggest name in town at the time. So he married well, and he had this huge estate. It was one of the few houses on First Cliff. It had a commanding position right in the center of that kind of circular road that goes around there, and it's still there. Looks pretty much like this, although there's been a lot of stylistic changes to it. Okay, George Walbach. Now, moving back to Country Way, Upper Country Way, not far from the Ellis house is the Dr. George Newcomb house. And this is another one you can't see too well from the road, but it's on the same side of the road. This was built in 1889. And I think you can see Dr. George Newcomb standing on the big rock in front of his house there. The house looks pretty much the same as it did back then. It's very well cared for. All right, turning to 1900, it's a key and kind of turning point for housing in Scituate because you have the Gilded Age. You have a lot of wealthy people. And it's more than just the ones who had the Scituate old family connections. It's other people who are looking around and saying, oh yeah, Scituate, that would be a good place to have a nice summer home. And most of these grand homes were summer homes. It was a lot of money put into these homes just for use for the summer. But remember, back then, summer wasn't 2 weeks. It was probably late May to early October. And with the train being there, a lot of these businessmen could commute into Boston to take care of their business, which is really what Thomas did from his estate at Dreamwold, is take a special train into Boston, and Tom Lawson would take care of business there and then come back out. And of course they had the telephone by then too. Actually, the phone came to Scituate by the late 1800s. So they had good ways to communicate with their offices back home. Plus, this was an age when professional architects were starting to do work for private clients for their summer estates. The grandest examples are probably up in the north shore of Scituate, but we have a few examples here in town. And here's one that I really like. It's what I call the Parker House. I haven't found that there's been any particular name for it, but it was owned by a woman named Elizabeth Parker. It was built about 1900. Actually, the year before Thomas Lawson built his house. And it's very close to Cohasset. It's at 180 Border Street. And I just checked before I came over here. It's still on the market, if anyone's interested. I'm not a realtor, and I don't get any share of any commission for sale of this house, but I have been through it. This is one of my photos, and you'll see some more of it too, but it's just a terrific house, and it's in terrific shape too. I mentioned it's close to Cohasset. It's probably the last house you get to on the right before you enter Cohasset. Border Street is this really cute little windy country road.
Is this before Border Street Bridge?
I don't know. So this is just before you reach the border, and really Elizabeth Parker was more oriented towards the Cohasset Summer Society. And even though I've checked in the Cohasset history books, I haven't found any really good mentions of her, so she's a little bit of an elusive character. But let me show you a few things that I found. She was an artist. Here's an example of her work. It's held by the Boston, it's available through the Boston Public Library website. There's a few other pictures there if you want to check it out. She was an art lover. She wrote in a letter to Isabella Stewart Gardner, who was one of her friends, that about the history of one of these paintings that she had bought in Italy while she was traveling over there. She was clearly a blue blood from the Back Bay. She had a place, her main home was in the Back Bay in Boston. Middle name was Frothingham, and her son by her first marriage was an architect, so my theory is that this house was designed by him, but it can't confirm that unless you have some other information like blueprints. So here's an interior scene that again, a photo that I took of the house, a cute little kind of relaxation area. Notice the windows there have these diamond paned windows at the top. So it looks like original furnishings for the windows. And a beautiful fireplace with the molding around that. Again, that all looks original, and it's really fresh too. It looks like it was just put in. I think it has 7 chimneys, and a recreation room in the basement with all the electronic facilities there. So, turning to Sunnycroft, we now return to the Pierce family. I should say they called themselves the Purses, but I'm going to stick with today's more conventional name. I should point out that the S.S. Pierce family, it was different again, but they also wanted themselves to be called as the Purses. So there's some kind of maybe connection there. But this house, if you look, it's pretty basic. It's kind of a salt box type, or a basic type colonial. And the reason for that is it was built in about 1800 by Stephen Litchfield, but not our Stephen Litchfield. And it was moved over to a different spot. This is on Captain Purse Road. Remember, Captain Pierce is the one that got killed in the war with King Philip, so the road finally got named after him. So it was appropriate that the Pierce family settled on Captain Pierce Road. Silas Pierce II purchased this property, and then he gave this to his daughter. But he gave the old family estate went to the son, Silas Pierce III. And that was actually not far from, it was right at the corner of Country Way and Captain Pierce Road. So they were pretty close. The brother and sister could go back and forth and see each other. And they also had access to the Egypt station on the railroad, so they could actually just walk over to the railroad station and take the train into town whenever they needed to. So I said this was built in 1800, but when this passed to the next generation, about 1900, there was a big fire and a lot of it was burned. And so the new owner decided to redo it, and this shows how it looked after that was redone. But I want to point out on the left side, you see another water tower, and it had steps going up to the top, so it gave you a great observation from the top of that water tower. So this was the home of Lucy Pierce Nichols, was born in 1853, died in 1910. And if you look at the 1903 map, that's her name on the property. And the name of the property was Sunnycroft. So like many summer people, they had names for their houses. And you could name your own summer house after whatever name you wanted to. Her daughter, Myra Hall Nichols White. Nichols was, the name Nichols creeps in here because he worked for the Silas Pierce Company and worked his way up, and also married the boss's daughter, so that helped a lot. But he was a big help for the business, one of the company's directors, I believe. And then their daughter was Myra Hall, and she married a White, and the White family has been in Scituate and other places ever since. Myra was a graduate Phi Beta Kappa of Radcliffe College. She was there during the time when they were forming the suffrage movement. So I was looking for a connection there, but I couldn't find out if she was a suffragist or an anti-suffragist. So maybe in my next talk we'll be able to talk more about that. This is a view from the water tower, looking at the back of the house. And thank you, George, for providing this, George White. You can see there's a circular driveway in back. This matches the circular driveway in the front. And there's a great, elegant garden there on the right, in back of the house. So you can see it's a pretty extensive estate, summer estate. Okay, we'll move over towards the Scituate, towards Hatherley Country Club. And this house, if you go to the corner of Bailey's Causeway and Hatherley Road, this is right there. And this is one I haven't finished the complete work on, but it was built about 1916. And it has a sign in front that's called Ledgemere. I don't think that was original. I think a later owner told me that was added by her family. The Goddards owned it in 1950. They had at least one, maybe two stores in town and on Front Street that some of you may remember. But the guy Nichols who started this, he was into real estate as far as I can tell. Again, not a lot of information about it, but this is a picture of him with his grandson, and he was a treasurer of the Hatherley Country Club. Of course, he didn't have far to go to play golf. He'd just go across the street, and there was the clubhouse. He, at this time, was promoting bridle paths for horses and ponies, for the one like his grandson is sitting on right there, from Scituate up through Cohasset and maybe on up into Hingham. I'm not sure if those bridle paths are still there. Some other historian might want to check that out. That'd be kind of an interesting project to do. This photo's from the Boston Globe in 1922, when he still lived at that house. Next we'll move, let's see how we're doing on time. Next, we move to the Edward Feely House. This house was built by, designed by an architect named Charles Greco, and he was so proud of it, he got pictures of it in the American Architect magazine, which I've copied here. You might, look at the top left, you might recognize that, but I've got a more recent photo of that if you don't know. What's not there anymore is that broomstick handle fence that's in front, because it would cost the new owner so much money. It was going to cost $35,000 or so to replace that. So I would have called, I would have gone with plastic. Edward Feely was president of the Bay State Chemical Company. He was director of the Children's Sunlight Hospital, which was kind of the successor to that Children's Sunlight repair shop. After that 1923 fire, they moved into one of the buildings at Dreamwold. And he was in the same Brookline parish near Coolidge Corner as the Kennedys. Joseph Kennedy and his family were all there in St. Aidan's in Coolidge Corner. But there's more political history to this house too that I wanted to mention. Its value at the time was $15,000 according to the tax assessors, and there's only two other properties for residential use that exceeded that. One was the Glades Club, and the other was the Dreamwold Hall by Thomas Lawson. So this was the third, it's tied for third most highly valued house in town at the time. That's what it looks like today. If you go to the corner of Hatherley Road again and Gannett Road, that's the house. Okay, I mentioned the Feely family. This is one of their daughters is on the left, nice looking woman, a 1914 photo. The guy in the middle, anyone recognize that? Curley, Mayor James Curley, actually spent summers there. And most people, if you ask where did Curley spend summers, they'll point to this house. And I talked to his son. He said, yeah, we spent a year or two at that house, but then we moved on to another one. And then finally they moved to one on Chapel Corner, which is not far from here. Chapel Corner is, I forget the names of the streets, but it's in North Scituate Beach community, not far from the Feely house. So Curley, as we know, was a huge Democrat. The next guy was a huge Republican. He was the next owner of the property, Ernest Goulston. Was considered dean of the Boston advertising men, and he consulted for the Republican Party and helped to run a lot of their campaigns. So this house flipped from the Democrats to the Republicans. I'm not making any predictions here. And he married Frances Demarest, and here's Frances on Broadway. It's a terrible photo, but it's taken from Harper's Bazaar from 1915 when she was at her peak. And you can see she's the center of attraction. There's chorus girls on both sides of her. She was the center of the show at the time. Now, finally, to our final one. This appears on the posters for this property. One of my favorite houses. You got to have a water tower. Notice on the top there are this bulging part. Those are the steps that lead up to the top, where there's an observation place from there. And this had a great view of the Atlantic Ocean from there. There's still some views of the Atlantic Ocean. It's off of south of Gannett Road. It's not North Scituate, it's south of Gannett Road. It's off of Hollitt Street. And this recently was on the market, but it's sold, and I think whoever got it got a lot of house for the money. And I was able to go through when it was open, so some of my photos here are from just a few months ago. Just to go back, this was built in 1903, just a year after Thomas Lawson was building his house. But the whole farm, Bulrush Farm, was developed and put together, or put back together in 1870s by David Townsend, who was from Boston. And then after David died, the estate went to the farmer's foreman called Moses Brown. He was a Scituate guy. And then he sold it to Wendell Brown, who had no connection to Scituate and no connection to Moses Brown. They were unrelated. Wendell Brown was a huge lumber dealer in Boston and was quite wealthy. And you see his name on the 1903 map as owner of the property, but actually his wife Harriet Brown owned the property all along. This is an example of some of the diamond paned windows in the house. These are not typical for the era. I'm sure when he was selling lumber, he had the available lumber and details like this that he could bring in from Boston for the property. So it's really a great example of woodwork of the time. Here's an interior shot showing the old fireplace on the right, built-in shelves and so forth on the left. You can see the beamed ceilings here. This is an ingle nook with a fireplace, kind of seating area on both sides. This is the steps going from the first floor to the second floor. Notice the, I don't know what you call those, balusters, I guess, balustrades. Those aren't your standard balusters that you see on people's steps these days. So he had there was a lot of special touches in this house. And the great room, which really was all by itself as a separate wing on the house, on the left in the photos that you see. And what I like about this one, I mean, it's just a big space, but at the end is this nice fireplace with a moose head at the top. I'm not sure that went with the house when it sold. And that's the house today. So good luck to the new owners. So to conclude, we have a great, rich deposit of grand old homes in town. Many are survived and are well cared for. Some are hidden away, so if some of you know some, in fact, Sue just gave me a photo of an old house tonight. There's nothing like these old photos to get me off running again, trying to find out more about these houses. And if you have something, let me know, Lyle Nyberg at Comcast.net. And I will try to do my best, but there's no guarantees because it's a lot of work to do the research on these houses. I've done over 50 now that are now filed in the state database.